May the words of my mouth and meditation of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and our Redeemer.
Amen.
Amen.
So first, an informal poll. How many of you got a clear idea of what Paul was trying to say in this passage of 1 Corinthians? Yeah, me either. So we have conversations at home from time to time. My wife, Lisa, as I'm sure you all know, is also a priest. And she is on a 2-week stretch where she's not preaching. And I won't say whether or not we talk about getting to preach or having to preach at home. But she says, so what are you going to choose? And I said, well, not Corinthians. She goes, yeah, I know, right? It's unintelligible. But again, we talked a little bit about this in adult formation this morning. Is most of Paul's letters are written to particular groups of people about particular problems they were having in their churches. And without the context of what he's speaking about, without the backstory, it's difficult for us to make sense of where he's going with that. So I'm going to take the coward's way out, and we're going to talk about the other readings instead. When we first looked at it, I saw that there was a reading from Genesis. I thought, well, maybe it'd be apt for us to change this about Noah and the ark, given the events of this week. But it's about Joseph and what happens with him. And it's a terrific story that is helpful and meaningful. The bone I have to pick with those who put the lectionary together is that there's no context for this story. And without a knowledge of what Joseph has gone through, it's difficult for us to put in perspective the magnanimous way in which he treats his brothers. And it also neglects the hedging of his bets that happens afterward. So I want to talk a little bit about that to set the stage for the point of what I want to say for us today in terms of our individual practices of faith and spiritual discipline, as well as our ongoing life together as a community. Ready, set, go. Okay, so we know how Joseph ended up in Egypt, right? How did Joseph end up in Egypt with this great job? He was sold into slavery. Why was he sold into slavery?
Because he was favorite son.
Yeah, they didn't have the courage to kill him, basically. What was the reason for the brothers killing or throwing him in the pit or selling him into Egypt? What was their real reason? What were they jealous of?
A coat of many colors.
And why did he get a coat of many colors?
Daddy's favorite.
He was Daddy's favorite. There we go. So this is part of the understanding is that we have to continue to ask questions to get to what the real issue is. One of my first bits of advice in preaching came from a dear friend. It was before I was really even in the ordination process. She said a few things. One of them was, try and only preach one sermon a Sunday. Try and decide what you're going to do. And try and get it down to its core, to its sentence. It's one sentence, one word if you can. And I think that the word here today is resentment. The story of what we resent about the world around us. We're built to look around and compare. We're given the ability to discern things as they seem to be visually, but sometimes we don't have the tools to discern how things are spiritually. And that's part of what I think we get from the lesson in Genesis and what Jesus is making commentary on as he concludes his part of the Sermon on the Plain that we heard last week. Remember, he said a whole list of blessings and woes, corresponding blessings and woes. And that woe doesn't necessarily mean that it's horrible for you, but to say that there's a flip side to every reality, that there is darkness and light to everything. There are two sides to every coin. The ability we have to make judgments about what's going on in the world around us leads us to make comparisons, which leads us to try and figure out who's better than someone else. We're wired that way. And it really is part of what came into our abilities, what came into our souls, what came into our firmware, I guess. I mean, you know the difference between hardware, software, and firmware, right? I don't. But Firmware exists somewhere between software, which makes the hardware work, and the hardware, which just without instructions is just a thing. But the firmware needs updating every once in a while. And the updating that I think we need to continually have is part of the reason that we have this liturgical calendar that takes us through seasons of introspection, takes us through long seasons of simply being, and then it also takes us to seasons of great rejoicing and jubilation. That we engage all of human emotion as a way to understand the complexity of who we are and how we respond to the world around us. Joseph gets thrown in the pit because he's perceived to be daddy's favorite. This is part of an ongoing biblical theme that says it is not the oldest that seems to be the favorite. There seems to be some favoritism that goes on with younger children. Right? We think about Ishmael and Isaac, the rivalry there. We think about Jacob and Esau, who was the favorite there. There is some kind, sometimes you get this jumping over of folks, and so there's this built-in notion, there's the prodigal son, right, even into New Testament language. Look for, if you start understanding these themes when they emerge, sometimes our humanity tends to make more sense. The genius of Scripture is in its humanity, not in its divinity, in many ways. That we understand ourselves more because we understand God's relationship with us and with all of humanity. The green-eyed monster of envy is at work in both of these stories. Jesus is warning us against taking retribution to those who have persecuted us. He's just told us that we're going to be blessed when we're poor, we're going to be blessed when we're persecuted, and that woe to us who have a lot now because we're going to be let down later. He's just finished saying that, but he feels the need to reinforce that to the disciples in particular and concrete ways. He says, look, don't do the things that everybody else does. I started reading a book this week called Resident Aliens that was kind of a new book when I was in seminary, and I never got around to reading it. Now it's 25 years old, but it's as important today as it was when it was written 25 years ago. It talks about the people of God as the countercultural movement in the world around us. That we are resident aliens, which has its own connotations in America at this day. But remember that the children of Israel were resident aliens in the land of Canaan. Abraham's not a homeboy from Canaan. He came from Iraq, Ur of the Chaldees. That we are all in some ways transplanted from one place to another, whether it's physically or spiritually. That we are set in a particular time and place that is not our home. And ultimately our home is where? Heaven, right? Any of you particularly homesick? Not me. There's still work to do, right? And I think that's what Jesus is saying, is that we need to continue these countercultural practices to help undercut the way that human nature tends to play itself out. I'm an oldest child. I know that there's some comparing that goes on between younger children and older children. I only have to go back and look at our family photos to recognize just how much attention I paid to our firstborn and how few pictures there are of Jonathan. Right? Where are the kid pictures of Jonathan? Lisa asked me. I don't know. Maybe I lost in the divorce, but I think that would be the easy way out. It's just that we were too busy with 2 kids to be so focused on one. Think about having 12. It's exactly what happens to Joseph. He ends up in Egypt. He interprets Pharaoh's dreams. He becomes the favorite. And all of this happens, as he says in today's readings, for a purpose. That he was sent there to ensure that the faithful remnant of Egypt, or the faithful remnant of Israel, survives the long famine that is going on there and that has been mitigated in Egypt because of Joseph's foresight and his ability to read the signs of the times. He has had the Egyptians in Pharaoh's court put away grain in abundant years so that there would be enough for times to come. Joseph, how he pulled this off is one that I'm not still sure of, but Joseph is in the presence of his brothers, and he knows he's in the presence of his brothers, but somehow he hides himself. And he has this great big reveal and says, hey, I'm your brother. I'm the one you threw into the pit. Can you imagine how they must have felt? This is the second most powerful person in the most powerful empire of the age. And he has just said, I know who you are. And this is what you did. And what does he do? He forgives them. Not much changes sometimes, right? When Jacob and Esau finally meet on the plain, Jacob goes out to meet Esau, and he's absolutely convinced what's going to happen. Esau's going to kill him because he has every right to kill him. What does Esau do? He hugs him and holds him to himself and says, my brother, it's all fine. I've turned out okay. Joseph's pretty magnanimous, but not completely. He wonders if his father is still alive, right? And so he said, and they don't know, because they've been sojourning in Egypt, they're waiting, they've been sent there to get food to keep people from dying. So they said, I don't know. So what does Joseph suggest they do? Go back and find out, right? Does he let them all go? No, he holds somebody back. He understands human nature just a little bit. He goes, if I let them all go, they may never come back. Which one of the sons does he keep?
Benjamin.
And why does he keep Benjamin?
True brother and dad's other favorite.
He's the true brother and dad's other favorite, right? He understands human nature. He says, well, we'll keep his favorite to make sure that they bring him here, right? And so once the reunion is complete, there is this putting back together of what seemed to be irretrievably broken. But it's not done without a little bit of guile. That it is part of a precursor of understanding what it is to be as innocent as doves and wise as serpents. It is part of what Jesus calls us to. It's part of what he says in Luke's gospel. He says, you need to do all these things, but to recognize it's not going to be entirely safe. But it's going to be absolutely good, and it's going to be positively worth it. The worst trap that we can fall into, it seems, according to the text of this, is the trap of resentment. We can't condemn those around us who seem different than we are. We can't take stock of everybody else's life and expect to come to some kind of freedom and healing on our own. Individually, I'll leave that to you, what it looks like. Corporately, I want to suggest to you that we have an ongoing challenge, and one that I understand completely about where we are and who we are. We went through a long desert experience, you more than I did, 4.5 years with no clergy. And it is human nature to try and figure out whose fault that is. Sometimes, remember the old bumper sticker? Blank happens. Stuff happens. And we don't know its purpose. If anybody had reason for resentment, it was Joseph. And somehow he was able to say, hey, stuff happens. And to get his mind around the goodness that can come out of the stuff that happens. I think it's bad theology to say everything happens for a reason. I think it's much better theology to say God can reason with whatever happens. That the blessings of God are not dependent upon our choices or the suffering that we have. But in many ways, the suffering that we endure makes us more open to the grace of God. So whoever we might blame for a long journey in the desert, I would invite you as part of a spiritual discipline and a freedom to give that up. To give it up. It's not doing you any good. One of the things that I learned, one of the great things among many that I've learned in churches that are not in church buildings or not in church sanctuaries, but oftentimes in church basements, was this saying: resentment is like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die. We can hold a grudge against someone for as long as we want to, and it doesn't harm them a bit because they don't really know. Whereas my dad used to put it long before I heard the saying in the church basement. He goes, you know, son, people don't get up in the morning with the express purpose to figure out ways trying to piss you off. Doesn't happen. Very few people like that. There are few, but not many. The call for us now is to leave behind what is past that no longer feeds us on the journey, and take that best part of who we are and the experiences that we've had and go forward, innocent as doves and as wise as serpents, to try and follow the course that God has set for us, leaving aside resentments and bitterness and moving into the promise and hope that God has for all people. Because God has laid up for us an abundance in our absence. In the away time that we have had, in our time searching for sustenance, God has laid away an abundance. And it is time for us to find that. So as we get ready to move into the Lenten season, it is about what we will let go in order that we can find those great things that we need to pick up. A little meme every day in my an app in my phone is you have to say no to a lot of really good things before you can say yes to the really great thing. So help us as a community, individually, and as people of God, to learn to say no to what is good, so that God can reveal to us those things that are great. In Jesus' name.
Amen.